Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the American Hotel. My name is Gavin Manu. I'm the publisher of the Express News Group, the Sag Harbor Express, the Southampton Press, and the East Hampton Press. We were here last month having a discussion about historic preservation balanced with development, and the communities of Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, and Nineveh came up several times. So it's appropriate that we had this event scheduled next to discuss the SANS neighborhoods and planning to protect historic communities. It's also appropriate, I just wanted to mention that we're having this particular discussion today as we remembered B. Smith this week, who just passed away. I understand she was an important and well-loved member of these communities, and our condolences go out to her friends and family. In a moment, we'll introduce our panelists, but I'd first like to thank everyone here at the hotel. Ted, Mary, Julian, Chef Jonathan, their entire team. They've been tremendous hosts for us. Thank you, everybody at the hotel. Also, just a quick moment to recognize some members of our team. Ellen Dioguardi, our Director of Events. Thank you, Ellen. Stephen Kautz, our reporter, and Michael Heller, our photographer, will be covering today's event, and the coverage will be in next week's paper. Thank you both. My wife and the editor of the Sag Harbor Express, Catherine Manu. And Brian Boyhan, our longtime partner, who will help me moderate today's event. Combined between Sag Harbor, Southampton, and East Hampton, where we're doing these sessions, we've done 14 events since last fall, and bringing sort of important topics to the community. It ranges from business issues to housing issues to environmental issues, and we couldn't do any of this without the help of our sponsors, who I'd like to mention. Our lead sponsors include the Sag Harbor Variety Store, Lisa Field. Thank you very much. Attorney John Leonard couldn't be here today, but thank you, John. The Sag Harbor Chamber of Commerce, which is always represented by a lot of members here today, and also I'd like to mention Harbor Frost is tomorrow, so come on down to the village, but thank you very much to the Chamber. They're very supportive. Some of our session leaders include Saybrook Capital. Luke Babcock is here with us today. Thank you, Luke. BNB Bank, Advantage Title, and the Adam Miller Group. Thank you all. And lastly, our session partners are Burke & Sullivan, Save Sag Harbor, Fisher's Home Furnishings, the Sag Harbor Inn, and F. Michael Hemmer Land Surveyors. Thank you all. I also want to mention LTV. They've been a tremendous supporter of ours. They film these sessions. They provide us with technical support, and they obviously air the sessions on TV for anybody who couldn't make it. So thank you, LTV. Now I'd like to move on to today's discussion. Our panel includes experts in the field of historic preservation, as well as residents who know these communities inside and out, as well as a village official. From left to right, we have Sarah Kautz, who's the Preservation Director for Preservation Long Island. Julian Adams, the Bureau Director for the New York State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Division for Historic Preservation. Thank you, Julian. Renee Simons, who's a SANS resident and an advocate. Dr. Georgette Grier, the Executive Director and Curator at the Eastville Historical Society. And Bob Plumb, who is a Sag Harbor Village trustee. I'd also like to mention Donnamarie Barnes, who was going to be a panelist of ours, but we had a little bit of confusion. But Donnamarie is a longtime SANS resident. She's the curator at the Sylvester Manor, and she's going to help us from the floor as well. Each of our panelists has been provided a question that I'm going to use as a means of introduction. We've asked them to keep their remarks to about 3 minutes, so we can have plenty of time for discussion. And then Brian will take questions and comments from the floor. We ask you to introduce yourselves, speak into the microphone, and also try to keep your comments brief so we can hear from as many folks as possible. All right, so we'll start with Sarah. Sarah, if you could just grab the microphone there. Preservation Long Island is a nonprofit committed to working with Long Island communities to ensure the preservation of cultural heritage. As director of the nonprofit, you also served on the steering committee for SANS. How did you become aware of what was happening to the SANS communities? And can you explain why it is so critical the history and culture of SANS be preserved and recognized?
Hi, good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me. And it's good to see Renee and Georgette and our partners on this project. I'm from Preservation, Long Island. We used to be called SPLEA, the Society for the Preservation of Long Island Antiquities. And you guys probably know us best for the Custom House on Main Street, which is one of our historic properties that we own and operate. And in addition to owning and interpreting historic properties, we also do advocacy across the region of Long Island, which is geographical Long Island. So we focus mainly on Suffolk and Nassau County, but also Queens and Brooklyn. And when I started about, let's see, it was 2016. It was August 2016. I started at Preservation Long Island. And probably like within the first 2 weeks I was there, I got a call from Georgette. And she was telling me about SANS and the issues. So I said, all right, I'll come out. And Renee had organized a community event at the church, and I, had no idea that there was going to be like 200 people there. But I had done a little bit of preliminary research on some of the founders. So Amazingly Meredith, who was born in Virginia, as well as her sister, and I'm sure you'll talk a little bit more about it. But it became very obvious to me that even though folks who visit the community may see a very common mid-century community. You can see these, across Georgia, South Carolina, California. But the thing that made this really stick out was once you started looking into the history and how it was developed, it was a community of color. It was African-American families buying property, taking loans from each other, and also working with Elsie Gale, who's Daniel Gale's wife. And it's a funny connection because our headquarters is in Cold Spring Harbor in Huntington, and Elsie is from Huntington, and Daniel Gale was based in Huntington. So they partnered with Ameza and her sister and the community that they had. And they were professionals, they were teachers, but this community included architects, doctors, lawyers, all kinds of professional people of color who were looking for a place that they could have a second home. So this community was developed as a second home. So, and I have to say too, it's before civil rights, so it's in the 1940s. So this is a time when people of color across the country are facing redlining, they're facing restrictive covenants. So just up the island in Levittown, you had restrictive covenants that didn't allow people of color or Jews to buy property in the community. So this is what folks are kind of struggling with at this time. And these are people looking for a place where they can start a summer community. And they found it here, and they were able to do something really remarkable. And it is certainly local. It's a special place for Sag Harbor history, and they really, brought a new chapter to Sag Harbor's history. And it should be celebrated because the community also became very important for civil rights, the end of Jim Crow, all kinds of wonderful things happened in that community. And they continue to be at the forefront of advocating for concerns that are village-wide. So preservation, history, how do we celebrate our this fabulous community, and what do we do? What do we do with planning? What do we do with zoning? Those kinds of issues. So I've been so lucky to work with these ladies and the other folks in the community, and I learned a lot doing this, and I hope that everybody in the village, not just in SANS, but everybody in the village can be proud of this community as a part of the village's heritage, because it's so special. It's significant, not just locally, but nationally and internationally. It's a very important, significant place. And again, it doesn't necessarily look like it has fabulous architecture designed by world-famous architects, but the story behind it and why it's there is incredibly remarkable. So we're so happy to be part of it. And again, thanks to everybody who worked so hard since 2016. And I've come along with you, so I feel very close to this project. And congratulations on the National Register listing.
Julian, as the Bureau Director of the State Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation Division, can you tell us what is it about SANS that made it a candidate for recognition? Is it gentrification of culturally and historically important communities, something the Bureau is seeing throughout the state? And is it hampering preservation efforts?
Thank you. Just for a short phrase, I'm with the State Historic Preservation Office. We're lodged in that larger entity there, but
Okay.
It's like, state agencies have all these layers. We're down with the Historic Preservation Office, also known as the State Historic Preservation Office of New York State. We oversee all state and federal historic preservation programs for New York State. Act as a federal liaison as well as for state programs as well. This community is rare in New York State and actually rare in the United States for a fairly intact African-American resort community. It really is rare. There's a great lecture that was given by a professor from Virginia. Was it last year? Last year, where I learned so much more than I thought I knew something. I learned even more how so many of these places were swallowed up or eaten or people were priced out of them or anything else. So this is actually so amazing this is here, and it's flown under the radar for a long time in our office. We are now actually moving past what we call the great man theory of history, that it's only the big houses, the fancy buildings, the big churches, the courthouses. We're looking down the history is embodied in our communities as they were built by the people who lived there. And this community is certainly a 100% example of that. It reflects the history, it reflects the need, reflects how people wanted to be there, how they wanted to live there, and how people want to still live there. It's something that has an amazing cultural significance, and that's another thing we've been expanding our eyes out, looking past architecture, looking past amazingly big events, looking at cultural significance. Properties can have that at many levels. The first thing that came to mind in that whole theory was basically Native American cultural sites that may not have any architecture on them at all. They might just be sacred mountains or medicine wheels or things not perceivable in the landscape. That came on to other things that now come into things such as African-American resources, Jewish resources. We're very on the forefront in our office with LGBT resources in New York State. There's a very strong state for those resources as well. We're actually trying to open our eyes and find the resources in the history that is in our state in these communities. To the second part of the question, gentrification is kind of a sideline issue. This is not, we don't deal with gentrification. What gentrification typically means taking a neighborhood and shoving everybody out and filling it full of rich folks. That's the old traditional thing. The houses people lived in for years, maybe they've run down a little bit, they've been fixed back up, and the people get priced out of them. That's a classic gentrification thing. We actually work to try to keep communities stable and communities together. We do a lot of low-income housing, we do a lot of affordable housing, we do a lot of market rate housing. It's whatever the community desires and needs. We work with that. The funny thing about this community is it's not, I said to you earlier, this was not the poor side of town. As Sarah just said, this was a community of skilled, educated people who built and lived how they wanted to there. Excuse me? Oh, skilled, educated people. And the issue is there, we have that record of them there. It's something that is, we're not going to be gentrifying. We're hoping to find a way, talking today with the people on the table, talking to the community and working with our programs, how can we maintain that character into the future with the growth that's needed, the changes that's needed without destroying the character of the community?
Okay, thank you, Julian. Renee, as one of the key members of the committee behind the effort to have the SANS recognized for its historic and cultural significance on the state and federal level, what do you see as the next steps that need to be taken in order to truly protect the character of these communities?
Thank you so much. And I actually prepared some remarks because I know the 3 minutes was very tight, and I knew I wanted to get a few points in. As a resident of SANS, I see a very strong, priceless legacy that fostered an enviable sense of community, bar none. This sense of community is the heartbeat of these communities and was the magic carpet, in a sense, that kept SANS alive for over 70 years. In terms of the SANS organization and its efforts, we have been publicly communicating and engaging people for over 4 years, and we intend to continue to do that. Whatever happens in the future to protect the character of these communities, much rests with the hearts, the minds, and souls of those families who put their hard-earned sweat and tears into forming these communities through many a troubled water. Let us not forget the root cause of what happened, why we were founded. well, it goes back 400 plus years of disenfranchisement, including Jim Crow, which engaged in, as Sarah mentioned, redlining, illegal covenants that prevented black people living there, and discriminatory practices. My hope is this, people I've asked, that 100 years from now, SANS, respective names, subdivision names, will still be those names. That communities are still thriving, and that all are savoring and building on its sense of community, as well as valuing and respecting its roots. Alternatively, and in contrast, becoming, and this is a little editorial, becoming a Hilton Head type of transient vessel is not appealing to me and does not support a sense of community. So how important is SANS' continued survival? Very. Personally, I do not think history should be disposable. And examples of faded history are numerous. And for us, examples are the pre-Central Park existence of a place called Seneca Village. For those who didn't see the New York Times article, it talked about the lost village. So before Central Park, there was an African-American community there, thriving and surviving. Most people don't know that. Most people don't know there was a Black Wall Street that existed in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 100 years ago, and it was burnt down by people who didn't appreciate the fact that it was there and thriving. People may not realize there's something called Bruce Beach in LA. That was Manhattan Beach, that became Bruce Beach 100 years ago, and then within about 10 years was eradicated through eminent domain and other things to get rid of it. And these things were captured in the book, and this is what you were referring to, the University of Virginia professor, Andrew Call, when he said, the land was ours. And we had a presentation of him, of his work. The reason I mention that is that, yes, it is possible for SANS to go away. We think that, oh, it's here now, it will last. There's no guarantee of that. And it can go away 100 years from now. So clearly the Sag Harbor Village Code combined with the CLG, Certified Local Government Responsibility, have a role to play. In the end, let's hope and pray we are on the right side of history on any next steps that are taken. And in closing, I'd like to say, at this event, it was posed the question, what can we learn from SANS? And I want to go back, because this is relevant to those who did this in the 50s, and is relevant today, which is a Gandhi quote here. A small body of determined spirits, fired by an unquestionable faith in their mission, can alter the course of history. Today, at least, we are on the map, I know, and we are part of that history to come. But its story is not over yet, and nothing is guaranteed.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Georgette, SANS was recently named as one of the 7 to save by the Preservation League of New York State. Can you explain what that designation means and how you hope it will help preserve the SANS communities?
Well, for starters, I'd like to talk about why preservation to Eastville is important. One of the things is really forefront and primary in our mission statement is preservation of these communities. It is also important personally to me to have our story represented in the built environment. As Renee held up for you, our documents is usually that's the only way that we understand our history, because we don't have physical buildings other than our churches most of the time and some private clubs. So for me, to be a part of the American story, we must also be in that built environment. And this is one of the places that we actually are there, 3-dimensional and present. So for me, that's very important. Why reach out to our colleagues at Preservation in Long Island and also the New York State Preservation for Historic? When you think about the people that were a part of this, there was a conglomerate of people, some sitting here and some not, and we are still under advisement. As Julian said, this is something that a lot of people weren't aware of. There's only one other community that we had to look to in the beginning, which was Rapp Road in New York State, and Albany area. So for us, everyone is learning about this process. So 7 to Save will bring that attention to this process, also give us the ability to access funds that they have, access various reports and consultants that can help us move this forward. And the biggest thing is education. When you read the blogs and you read different things, you hear statements that are not true and are false. And when you look at that, education is needed. It's just like something that is out of sight, out of mind. When we started this process, we had many public hearings and public meeting spaces to talk about what this designation would mean. And so for me, thinking about guaranteeing the protection of this place, and preservation is not one individual thing. It's a collection of places, people, and stories. And that's what we have collectively in the SANS community. We say the SANS community, we know that there were 2 others as well. Not even just here. If you go to Southampton, there were also communities that had Hillcrest. Also, those communities disappear. To speak about gentrification, I think it's not gentrification, but more of a displacement. Displacement of these lives, displacement of these stories that we are looking to capture. And again, for me, it's not important just to have it in the written record. We need that. And sometimes there are holes and gaps in the written record as well. But I think the physical buildings, the place, the culture is really important. So we try to think about the benefits, which would be statewide publicity, listing properties that will benefit from the greater outreach and media. We also look at the education that we will have surrounding these communities, because think about it, so much has been learned just from a very surface level. We still are learning every day about these communities, about these people, about the connections between their personal lives, their professional lives, and their social lives. So that's really important. And 7 to Save is really going to bring us resources to help us do that, because for the most part, it's been a volunteer effort.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Bob, while SANS has achieved the goal of state and federal recognition, it remains at risk. How can the village of Sag Harbor help preserve the history, culture, and scale of the SANS communities? Is there a discussion happening about the path forward and the village's role?
I would say that we have informally, first of all, let me say this. I think it goes without saying that the spirit that you're trying to preserve is obviously an important thing. And it's sometimes the spirit is a little ethereal, and therefore translating it to, say, zoning code is not that clear. Everything that we've done, nothing has changed zoning wise. And the boards, the individual boards, the ZBA and the ARB are, I can tell you, looking for input. And they really do listen to neighbors. And I think that you have to look at these, say, proposed construction as individual situations, because that's the way they look at it. So if there's disagreement about a proposed project, then it would behoove everyone to go to the meeting and tell them that's how you feel. I was on the ZBA for a long time. We got applications from SANS, and being that it's outside of the formal historic district, we didn't really have written guidelines. And so it became then a matter of just, well, we'll give percentages of pyramid variances and things like that. And occasionally people would come in and comment, but it would have been very helpful if they did. And so I think that personally, I feel, and I'm not speaking for any of the boards, but personally I feel that mass and size is the most important element that needs to be kept, I guess I should say. Because the architecture, I think from earlier than 1970 is considered contributing architecture. Well, obviously there's a lot of styles, so that's really, as opposed to like a chrome purple house or something, the scale and size is the most important. So, and I think that would be the most important way to get across to these boards that when the individual projects come up, that the community members voice an opinion about what's happening. Because as I say, these boards they do it on a case-by-case basis. So for us to say blanketly, no variances in SANS is actually illegal, and it's probably unworkable anyway. Even if, it depends on which side you fall. You may want variances or you may not want variances, but whatever it is, it needs to be expressed to the people that are volunteers who are making these decisions. And I think that was probably the biggest recommendation that I could make for people to just express that. I think there's real understanding that that's the case, which is, in other words, that size and mass is really what we're talking about. And to the extent that we can control that, I know some of the lots have been melded, and thereby allowing a much larger structure. That is something that could be addressed in the code. We've also changed the definition of height of a building. And it's because SANS tends to be hillier, have more topography, it'll actually, the net effect will be to lower the theoretical size of a building, because it measures pyramid and setbacks differently. So that in itself will help. But again, I would just say that these boards are autonomous. We are not allowed to discuss individual applications. We can discuss general suggestions and guidelines, but it's really up to those that are affected. And just in closing, I'll say that the history of institutionalized racism in this country is appalling. And this is such an amazing example of something that got away, that was able to be established and be maintained. So I don't think there's any question that that is something that's of value and that really should be protected as much as possible.
Thank you. To Bob's point, one of the reasons why we have these sessions is to hear those voices and to encourage people to come out. I mean, standing in front of a village board meeting and having lunch at the American Hotel are two very different things. But it is important that happen, and we just hope to provide a start to these discussions and encourage people to share their thoughts. So with that in mind, I'd like to turn it over to Brian, and he'll take some questions or comments from the floor. Brian?
Thank you. Any questions immediately? Yes. Could I just ask you to give your name also?
Hello, my name is Lindsay McNeil. I live in...
Lindsay, stand up.
Happy Friday, everyone. My name is Lindsay McNeil. I have a house in Azurest. I just had a question regarding your size and scale. I believe there's a house by the architect Peter Cook, and it's in Sag Harbor Hills, and it's quite large, and now it's sitting on the market. If you go 6 houses down the other way, there's another house, large in scale, which was made, sitting on the market, and that's been 4 or 5 years now. So when you think about it, it actually changed the neighborhood. I don't know if you know what happened recently in the Two Bridges area in Manhattan, where you're trying to build, what is that, a 70-story building in a neighborhood where it's not conducive and it's not going to work. Also, it's not even near the trains. So when you're saying size and scale, it changes the whole neighborhood. It changes the whole look of it. And also, you have houses that are just sitting there. They might be nice, but to me, running every day, that's an eyesore. I just want to know, how can you guys regulate? And lastly, when we were designing our house in 84, 85, we were told we couldn't go an extra story. And now you have all these behemoth houses that don't even fit the neighborhood or kind of the culture, and they sit there. I just want to know how you're going to regulate the size and scale. Thank you.
Thank you. So to me, I know the houses you're talking about, and the houses you're talking about are the bad examples. They are the ones that, as far as, and the only reason those were, to my understanding, able to be built was because they melded lots. They combined lots. merge them, yeah. Okay, so again, the nature and makeup of these boards, the ZBA and the ARB, change over time. And therefore, the individuals who are on the boards may or may not have different opinions. And that is why it's so important to, if you want to make your voices heard, to go and talk to them. And to answer your question, I'm not sure if we can legally prevent merging of lots. I don't know if that's legal. We could do it if it was.
I've seen there's new specs for houses that are in Lincoln and Nineveh that are also going to be so large, or where it says it's a tear down. I've seen stuff on different real estate sites. I'm just saying, like, if we want to preserve or do everything, I'm understanding with people coming and new into the community, but when you put a house that doesn't fit a neighborhood, it just doesn't look right. If you go on Main Street and you go those houses, you can't build a certain size. You can't build unless it's regulated. Like if you go towards Mahashemuit, you see there aren't houses being built like crazy town. Like, let's just regulate it for our neighborhood too.
Right. Well, those houses presumably either got variances or didn't require variances. Obviously, you know, it's GFA, percentage of gross floor area in the lot. And what I'm suggesting is that if that's the community's general sense that that shouldn't happen, then that should be voiced to the boards. The problem is we can't do something called spot zoning, which we get in trouble with that. You can't, by state law, you can't just decide, okay, we're going to limit the GFA, lower the GFA in SANS, for instance, just as an example. They won't let you do that. The courts will throw it out and say it could be part of a much broader upzoning, rezoning, but it has to include a much larger number of lots, number of different conditions. We have the same issue here on the waterfront. We're dealing with exactly the same thing. But again, I think at this point, the most practical approach would be to go and complain about the individual applications. And I know there's another side to this. So the person who's building this house may feel exactly the opposite. They may feel like, it's my property, why can't I do what I want? And that's sort of where the crux of this falls, as far as I'm concerned.
You? And this gentleman also. Yes, go right ahead.
Am I on? Good. This is why we have panels to have different opinions in front of people. So we're not going to fight. We're just going to have different opinions expressed thing. The National Register listing of this neighborhood is an honorific only. It recognizes a history, it researches a history, it records a history for the national record, for the national level. We find out about things we didn't know about during this process many times, significance, architecture, anything such as that. The real protection of historic resources happens at the local level. The historic district here looks the way it does because that was put in years and years and years ago. No one waited for a crisis point to do it. It was done right then and there. I'm always reminded of other communities that wait for those crisis points. By the time you get there, sometimes they're like, what have we lost? What are we preserving now? We look at the buildings as having history in them. These buildings were built by these people who had nowhere else to build and wanted to build here and formed a community. We had people entertaining Langston Hughes, Lena Horne in these buildings, important African-American entertainers and literary figures of the 20th century because that's where they went. That is embodied in these buildings. Is every stick precious? Absolutely not. We always say that historic preservation at the state and local level, state, national level, and at the local level does not stop change, it manages that change. And the first thing we look to is looking at a building and going, can we preserve this? How can we preserve this? And if we want to preserve this, how do we make sure it's workable in 2020? Fire code use, plumbing, God knows what else, electricity, even extra bedrooms, bathrooms, anything else. We're not about stopping change. There was a great quote by the professor of architecture at Tulane University in the 1970s. He must have been psychic. He said, the basic purpose of preservation is not to freeze time, but to mitigate sensitively with the forces of change. And we would say, start with what you have first. Can you reuse it through sensitive alteration and change without blowing the character of the building or the community. We see that all the time. That's our stock and trade at the office. We do over $7 billion of investment upstate and downstate in the last 7 years. And we do that by maintaining buildings and making sure they're usable in 2020 and beyond for new uses or for new realities and living situations. That would be our first approach here at SANS, is to say, start with the building first. That's the record of the people who lived here. You can't throw that away just off the bat if you put something back that kind of fits the neighborhood. You've got to work with the building first.
May I add?
Go ahead, sure.
If I can also add, Bob, I'm not sure if you were a trustee at the time. When those buildings that are referenced came up, there were a number, I don't think you were, there were a number of residents that did come up and filed concerns about the size and square and thing. And we talked about the code saying that the job of the ARB was to manage character and scale. We actually also, I think Sag Harbor was involved, and I know that we spent a lot of money even on legal to kind of look at that. But the fact that the GFA code was there, it allowed it to happen. So it seemed like that trumped anything that the neighbors would want or ask for. So going back to SANS, okay, I mentioned that things could change. Things can change. Meaning if the GFA allows it, it can happen. I mentioned Bruce Beach in LA. Actually, the name was changed by the village, by the town and stuff. They said, we're just getting rid of Bruce Beach, and they changed the name to Manhattan Beach. And it wasn't until almost 100 years later, they said, you know, there was a history here that we ignored. Let's rename the place Bruce's Beach. That can happen to Azurest, Sag Harbor Hills, and Nineveh. You don't need Nineveh. And I was told by those in the village that those are artificial things, constructs. We cherish them, but they're artificial constructs that can be with new people on the board, new people as residents who don't have the legacy, which is going to happen. That's just life, generationally. It can change. So the question I always ask, so how do we hold it?
I just wanted to follow up on that question too. Eastville Community Historical Society, I mean, across the board, when you look from town to town, village to village, historically, minorities, African-American communities, or just for the sake of the others, was really not taken in consideration when many of people started to use historic district as a tool for preservation. You see this all over. And this is exactly why it happened to the SANS community. In the 80s, Eastville Community Historical Society started specifically because the current district at that time in Sag Harbor stopped on a block before Eastville Avenue, which to, of course, my founders was ludicrous because Eastville Avenue has St. David AME Zion Church, which is the oldest church in Sag Harbor on its original footprint. So as you see, when you look at what is valued in history, and again, this is all American history, sometimes the smaller in scale, or if you don't have the right familiar, family name, or if you were George Washington, they save an outhouse, they save a spoon. So for us, thinking about this is really important, and it's even archaeology. I work with Sarah has an archaeology background, and she can attest to this too, in architecture as well. Before, if they were doing digs on sites, if they find things, a lot of dishes and things, they would just discard it. Now we look at that and say, we can tell another story. Wow, the woman must have been, the woman of the house must have been entertaining. So she was a lady of society. Before, depending on who would dig that up, they would just discard it and not log it and not care. So for us, we have to make sure that the record is inclusive of all of our stories. But also, I think too, it's also for some and not for all, a retraining of thinking how we use traditional frameworks to actually tell stories in the history. So with that being said, there also, as the Preservation League is a partner with the Commission Assistance and Mentoring Program, on May 4th, of this year, there is going to be a training that the Preservation League of New York State is doing here in Sag Harbor at the library. And this will help you with the basics of fundamental background on preservation law as it relates to local preservation commissions, local ordinance, local codes, and the federal and state laws. This is important because for us, Eastville is in the historic district now after a long-fought battle, and also in that registered form, we did make mention of the SANS communities. But at that time, it wasn't old enough to receive or be included or needed further study. So this is not happening overnight for Eastville. It's been on our radar for a long time. The first time it came to me is in 2011 when we actually had the moratorium, and I went to that I went to the firehouse there and I said, why aren't we considering the SANS community in this moratorium and these changes? It's worthy of preservation. But I do think because we're always not on the same page, that we can get on the same page. And even if you are sitting on these boards, you cannot allow emotion or your opinion. It's just like the juries that we've seen on television recently. How are they deliberating? Let's use the guidelines that we have before us. And of course, there is some wiggle room, but I think that a difference of opinion really should be based on facts and not alternative facts.
Thanks, Georgette. We have two other questions right here. Well, one, and then we'll get right back to you.
Hi, actually,
Can you identify yourself?
sure, I'm Vicki Sharp. I live in Nineveh in what is called the Pink House, which is now the Blue House. Right. What? I'm sorry, I always said, I'm sorry. My brother lives in Nineveh. I live in Sag Harbor Hills. Several of us in this room went to the meetings about the two houses on Hillside Drive East and their size. And we argued scale and harmony, and we were sort of told that that's kind of a soft part of the code. Well, a land use attorney, Jeff Bragman, brought a case in Southampton and won. And what did the court say? The court said that the Architectural Review Board in Southampton was at fault because they did not consider scale and harmony in approving a project. So there are legal grounds for our boards to say, this is what the code says. It's not fluff. Scale and harmony is a real issue, and we're going to apply those standards. So even, Renee, I think that went against whatever the GFR was for that particular property. It said it did not fit in with the community. So, and Steve Williams is here. He's on the ARB. I've sent him a copy of that legislation. I mean, of that ruling. I think it's really important because there are times when the court does back us up.
Thank you.
I just want to follow up because Preservation Long Island was involved in that case to some extent. We had written letters in support of the two families that brought the case against the neighbor. So just to be clear what that is, that proposal was a new construction in the historic district. And there was a conflict between what was allowable by zoning in terms of square footage, height, et cetera, and what the character was in the immediate adjacent historic properties. And they were designated historic properties. The ones in question are on Fairleigh Lane. They're some of the oldest, most important buildings in the district. And the proposal was for a massive, massive building that would have been just like a big rectangular wall right up next to them. And the ARB had decided because the main problem was the size and scale was just totally incompatible with the historic buildings adjacent. But because it was allowable by the zoning, they could do it. So when it went to the New York State Supreme Court, the decision said, well, actually, if you're in the historic district, size, scale, that's character. The size of a building tells you the story of the building. How big it is, the massing, where, how it's put together, all of that speaks to the history, the story of the building. So those are, we call it in the biz, defining characteristics, and that's all in the National Register survey already. That's in your survey, defining characteristics. It tells you what those are. Those are the things you have to make sure stay, because if you lose them, you'll end up having a cumulative effect. So it's not just one thing or two things, it's all the things. And then it's not one property or two or three. It's the cumulative effect of losing one after another. So there is a bigger picture in how we assess impact and adverse impact and negative impact and planning, where you do have to look at the bigger picture. But in that case, and specifically, it's really important because we see it, I see it in my work, I see it here in the village. There's this tension between the zoning, what's allowable by zoning, and then the character of the historic district. And the New York State Supreme Court said, if you're in a historic district, it is the charge of the ARB, LPC, to make sure buildings are in character, and part of that character is scale, mass, size.
Thank you, Sarah. Sir?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Errol Taylor. I am currently president of the Nineveh Beach Property Owners Association. And I've been coming out and to Sag Harbor for almost 25 years now, and have my house built and completed in 2006. And although my residence is not as massive as some of the new places, I would imagine if we were going to impose architectural restrictions that limited the character to the historical homes, my house wouldn't have made the cut, and frankly, I don't think Renee Simons would have made the cut either. My question is, how do you balance the interests of the homeowners now who have owned some of these historical homes? And these are some of the original homeowners, some of these pioneering African Americans and their descendants who own their homes, and most of their wealth is tied up in those homes. How do you balance their interest with the desire to limit scale and size of new construction? And I have to say, I applaud Renee and Simons and the others in SANS for what they've done and what they've been doing in preserving the history of the SANS community. It is so critical that we do that. But we have a difficult conflict here that no one has, I guess, addressed yet, is that these are some issues. We're talking about issues that deal with the wealth of our neighbors, and I think without really engaging those who have been here forever and whose major asset we're talking about, I think we're some ways missing the boat. And I hope we have a discussion, and I'd ask the panelists to chime in about how we balance that and how we address those issues and preserve the history. And I've heard a lot of discussion of historic preservation, and I'm not sure I understand, or we all have the same understanding of what that means. It is so important to preserve the history, culture, community that we've all loved in these communities. But I hope that we find a way to do that in a way that respects, all of the community members and the value they have in their homes.
Let's see. Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question, and it's, I think any district that's gone through historic preservation, this is a conversation that has been had.
If I can take that first?
Yes, please.
This is actually happens. I've never been on or not. This has been happening across the United States since historic preservation started happening in America in the 19th century. This is not a new discussion. It's not a new issue. Every community that's had how do we preserve our character of community has this conversation and has over 100 years. What we look at right now is the reality is that historic preservation designation, local designation, has been proven over and over again nationally and statewide to, number one, stabilize property values, and number two, improve them. Now, the issue here is these houses are still in Sag Harbor. They're not upstate in the Adirondacks. They're not $5 houses. The thing is, this neighborhood's going to have to change. Neighborhoods, communities have to change and grow to stay active and vital. That's the whole thing we're looking at, is how do you manage that change to keep the stories there and respect the property owners' rights, their value. We're not looking to diminished value. In fact, the value usually goes up with local designation and historic preservation designation. It's again about that managing change that is the issue. I always go up to, I live upstate New York in the capital region. Saratoga, when I moved to Albany, the Albany area 33 years ago, was a pretty rough town. A mall had opened on the outside of town, and they had 75% vacancy rate in their downtown, and the houses were worth $5. People looked around and said, what we have to sell to the world is us. You know, we're special. And they started investing in historic preservation, investing in their properties, locally designating, National Register designation, property value is stabilized, and now the mall is closing. Everything is moving back downtown, and people are building in those communities in a sensitive way, where there's a house that's outlived its usefulness or no longer has historic character or has, frankly, about to fall down. They guide the new development in those neighborhoods to maintain the neighborhoods. And Saratoga has very large-scale neighborhoods and very smaller-scale neighborhoods, and people are moving in and investing there because that's where they want to be, because of the sense of community, the walkability, and the sense of neighborhoodness. And I think that's one thing that I would hope would preserve in SANS as you go forward, managing that change and trying to figure out, rather than letting people come in en masse and wipe the entire community out, which has happened too many times in many communities of color across the United States, that this proceeds thoughtfully and progressively while making sure we're not strangling or handcuffing the property owners. That's number one there.
Thank you.
Could I
Go ahead,
just do
please,
for a
Renee.
second another one? Donnamarie. Donnamarie is I call a legacy family. She was raised here. And she was going to be on the panel, and I just thought that maybe to this issue, maybe you might want to say something. And a resident of Nineveh. Yeah.
Yeah.
That would help. Okay, so I'm a resident of Nineveh. I've spent all of my life in Sag Harbor. I was 6 months old when I first came, and I have been here every summer since, as have many others in this room. And I think what we're talking about, we have two different issues. We have the homeowners issue of what can and cannot we do, and what should the appearance of our community look like. And we have the preservation, historical preservation. Because of my growing up here in Sag Harbor and my love for Sag Harbor, it has given me two things. I'm a photographer, as many of you know. I photograph here in Sag Harbor, and I have all of my life. And it has led me to what is my career. I also am the curator at Sylvester Manor Educational Farm on Shelter Island, and it is part of my job to tell the stories of the people, of all of the people. And extending from Shelter Island to Sag Harbor to Eastville, and the community of African Americans, Native Americans, and European immigrants that made up Eastville, leading into the SANS communities. These are the stories that will go on and on, hopefully forever. And the work that I do now and that I hope to do in the future is about ensuring that that legacy of stories remains. So these issues that we confront about the houses that are built, the changes in our community, the ecological changes in our landscape, in our beach, in our wood area, those are things that we have to deal with now, and we have to be together in order to do it. But we also have to all agree that we have this legacy that we are protecting for the future to go forward, so that we're not a forgotten community, where 100 years from now, there'll be some symposium and some archaeologist who will say, well, I found this great find, and I'm doing this dig in this place called Nineveh, and I'm finding unbelievable things like cookout, pits or clam shells where they must have had a clam bake. That's not what I want. I want there to always have been a story about who was here. All of our stories. You know, in Eastville, we tell the stories of the whaling families who bought houses on Eastville and Liberty Avenue, of the women who were homeowners in the 19th century, and we looked at them as heroes. Well, moving forward, I want to know the stories about us. And the way that we do that is that we come together and we agree about it. And we preserve what's ours. We preserve what's ours through collecting and maintaining our family photographs, by telling our children and grandchildren the stories, and by sharing. Now, we're going to have a lot of issues that we're going to deal with going forward about the houses and how we maintain that. But we're in a very important part of history right now. And what we've done with SANS and what Renee and the committees have done to get this designation is an unbelievable achievement that we should be very, very proud of. It's very emotional. It's culturally so important for this time to recognize it. And that has to be the foundation. We can argue till we're blue in the face about whose house is bigger than the other. But unless we agree that that is where we're starting from and that's what we're working to maintain, none of it will ever matter.
Thank you. I have a host of questions over here. This gentleman's had his hand up for a while. Just identify yourself.
Okay. Good afternoon. My name is Stephen Roach. I'm the former president of the Nineveh Beach Property Owners Association before Errol Taylor. My family's been coming out to Sag Harbor since the 1930s, first in Azurest and then in Lighthouse Lane, and finally my parents built a house in the early 1960s in Nineveh Beach. I have a question that I'm going to ask, but first I just want to make a statement. You know, African Americans have a real legacy that we need to leave for my grandchildren, of which I now have 2, or will shortly have 2, and that legacy is a net worth. I don't know whether you generally have looked at the statistics among African Americans, but African Americans in this United States, on average, have a negative net worth, okay? My concern regarding further restrictions on the nature of our private community, by the way, Nineveh is the only private community of the traditionally African-American communities in Sag Harbor, so that has another bearing on this, is that it may have a chilling effect on the valuation of folks who purchase. You know, if my grandkids or my children want to, you know, sell the house upon my demise, it may have some type of negative impact on the net worth or the ability to obtain the value of the property. You know, the areas in Nineveh and Sag Harbor Hills, Azurest, Lighthouse Lane have traditionally had sales 30 to 40 to 50% lower in terms of valuation than those in the white community. So my question is that my question is what impact would the change that is being offered or pro-offered by, in addition to the national designation and the state designation, what impact would that have on the ability of my family upon my demise? Because I'm not going to make any significant changes other than make it available for me to, you know, have a ramp to get in my house when I'm older. But anyway, what changes, or what impact might that have on the ability to change the house in the future?
I just want to. Yes. I just want to kind of. Well, I guess it addresses your question, but first of all, I don't think we know what the plan is. I think the process of adopting a local landmark, so it would be taking presumably the National Register nomination and making it a locally designated district as well. So that process involves hearings. That process involves, it's a process. It's going to take a while for you guys to get through that as a village. So there is a formal process there, and I don't think we've even gotten to the point where we might even want to do it. So that's one thing. We're far, far away from this happening. So it's great we're starting the dialogue now, because a lot of times nobody knows until it's like, the 11th hour. And then folks get really upset that they didn't know. So this is great that it's happening so soon. And thanks to the Express for hosting this talk, because I think we need this a lot in our communities. But like what Julian said, historic districts stabilize and increase value over the long term. We have to look over long term. If you keep losing buildings, you're going to lose the character, the historic character. You'll have a new neighborhood that doesn't have a history. And, somebody pointed out there's 2 new buildings that are still on the market. Those are extremely volatile, and they have no relation to the rest of the community. The rest of the community is the thing that's giving it the value. Sag Harbor Village is the thing that gives property its value. So you have to kind of think of it in a big picture. There's a short-term real estate value where if you build a bigger house, sure. If you knock down $1 million house and build a $5 million house that's like 5 times the size, okay. But in terms of the long-term value, that new house doesn't have a tie to the history. It wasn't built like the others. There's no community there. So wait, one more thing, okay? I also want to say there's other communities that have local tax benefits. So other communities with historic districts have tax abatements. East Hampton and Southampton towns have a grant program that supports owners of historic houses in doing work in their homes. They also have an awards program in Southampton. So there's local programs that the village could consider.
People to please, excuse me, can I ask people to please allow her to finish? If you could if I could also ask you people to keep your voice down so that the rest of the room can hear. If you could, Sarah, if you could just wrap up. There's obviously some questions over here we want to get to.
I think she just, if I can have the mic, I think she just finished. I'd like to add, I know this has come up. I know I have done a lot of research. There's data. I know there's opinion and belief, but there is substantial data that shows facts that houses that are historically district designated, their value increases more than comparable houses that are not in the historic district. That's a fact. You can go and look it up. I actually have some of the studies here and happy to show you. The thing that does happen, which was interesting to hear, that the concern then becomes, because the historic districts gain value, as the local historic district does in Sag Harbor. I don't hear anyone talking about the historic district in Sag Harbor, those values being inexpensive because they're historic district. Am I wrong? Is it going up? And I know that we have been talking about looking at historic district for 4 years, and I know that houses that could barely sell for $500,000, and there's some realtors in here can attest to it. You can't touch a house in our area for less than $900,000 or $1 million. Am I wrong about that? And we know that we are looking. Hold on. We know we are looking. No. So I'm just saying. Right. I'm saying, but it's not a secret that we were looking at a historic district. But I'm going back to opinion versus the facts that have been documented.
Renee, I just want to let Steve get a word in here.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Steve Williams, and I was, I think, at one of the first parties when Renee was forming her team for SANS, and I gave her a check, and it was a significant check, and because it reflected a vision and a want that I had in terms of, I'm legacy in Azurest. I'm the president of the Owners Association, and I am there for 66 years. 3 weeks old when my parents finished the house, and we were the only house that had heat because it was a summertime house, but they had a 3-week-old baby. So I think that this is a very complicated, multi-layer conversation. And we can use statistics in any way, of a variety of ways. I'm sorry. I lived in Harlem. I recently sold my house. It was a legacy house also. It was a brownstone. And during the time when I bought it from my grandmother back in 1979, I'd say a third of the brownstones were owned by the city and vacant and abandoned and rat infested. Me and some of the owners decided that we were going to turn things around. We started a block association. We clean up the abandoned buildings, at least their outsides, twice a year. And Harlem was always desirable property because of its location, its infrastructure, and everything else. But it was an African-American community. As Harlem started to improve, people who couldn't afford to buy a brownstone on 93rd Street between Columbus and Amsterdam said to themselves, you know what? I can buy a brownstone in Harlem for like 45, 50, 70, 100 grand, put in work and live at the same lifestyle that my friends do, but I can't afford to. So we start what you're calling gentrification. But people are looking for value in the market and something that's approachable. I think part of this conversation assumes, now by the way, the brownstones were gut renovated very successfully, people moved in, and vertical integration, economic integration in the neighborhood started. We call that gentrification, just because of a cultural, racial difference. The truth of it is, architecture is one thing, and the owners and occupants of that architecture are something else. So the fact that our buildings don't change if we have a designation doesn't mean that we still can't get bought out. It doesn't mean that we still won't be replaced by people who aren't of the culture. So we had understood when we supported Renee, and I thank her again in public, as I have previously many times, that it was going to be a cultural designation that was not going to infringe on our options as homeowners. There are 150 contributing houses in these 3 communities. Now, I think that those people who are part of the contributing houses should be the ones who really ultimately make the decision. The people who live and own in a contributing house, the 150 that, should be the ones to make the determination as to whether we should go forward for local historical designation or not. I think that's fair. They gave their checks, they gave their money, they signed affidavits, they signed petitions and ballots supporting Renee and supporting SANS with the understanding that it was not going to infringe on their property rights. We're starting to change that, okay? If my son returns from San Francisco with wife and child and grandchild, I want the right to change the mass and scale on my house. If someone gets ill or dies and wants to relocate, they have the right to maximize their return on investment, particularly those people who have been legacy and provided the format by which SANS could get a designation. Harlem will be Harlem. We know about the Renaissance at Harlem, even if the occupants of Harlem aren't all black anymore. SANS can be SANS. It's a historical federal thing. I don't think it's so easy to change the name. But if the local government decides that they want to do it, they can still use the same techniques you mentioned before. So this is a very passionate issue. I think a lot of thought goes into it. It's romantic to put a historical designation over everybody. And I just want to say one other thing, by the way. There's a real myth going around here that the people who moved into SANS moved there because they had to. They moved there because they wanted to. They wanted to be together. They wanted to get a place to exhale from their hard professional weeks where they could laugh and not be the representatives of the African-American community. So there's a lot of different things that people assume about SANS. It's not. We didn't want to move downtown. And when we came here, Sag Harbor was a second. It was where the workers that supported the towns in East Hampton and a fishing village. Let's face it, right? So things have changed, and they've changed throughout Sag Harbor, culturally, economically, et cetera, and in the historic district, which I guess was run down. I really don't remember when I was that age. But so things have changed. Things will always change. And the fact that you keep the front of the building with a certain look doesn't mean that the residents are different people.
If I can very nice, thank you.
Thanks, Steve.
And also I should say, thank you for what, I want everyone to understand there is love here. I mean, the community is a sense of community that exists. And so to my story, as a digression, I came to Sag Harbor because I wanted to also in 2003. Why did I come? Because of the sense of community. And I appreciate the fact that it was referenced to my house and stuff like that. What you don't know as a story is that when I looked at my house and I needed to go from 2 to 3 bedrooms, this is before the historic, I didn't understand that. I didn't know about it, didn't even conceive of this, did not know about the 1994 effort that actually was to look at SANS for historic district. But what I did know is that I had a sense of community here. So when I put my architect, who I brought up to kind of look at it, the instructions to him is, don't change the footprint of the house. I don't want to change it. It was here for this long, let's keep it. Tell me, and I brought an architectural landscaper in, and I said, whatever you do, when you tell me which trees we can save, I don't want to change the trees. So you got to figure out how to, and the trees were actually, if you have sometimes oaks, they get old, where they get disease. So I understand all that architecture, but could you make sure that we save as many as we can? And not knowing the importance of the history in that sense that we know now, I was driven still to try to save what we could. So my point is that, and I am a romanticist, I guess I am. I think that the value is there. I do think that we have to have more discussion about what it is. I honestly, in my heart, believe 100 years from now, I'm not sure, I'm a business person. 100 years from now, SANS is not going to be necessarily what it was 100 years, or rather 70 years ago. I get that. But I do think it's important to try, as the last thriving entity in the United States, if there's a way to ensure that the names are not changing. By the way, they can change. Why can't they change the names? I had somebody, I'm going to tell a side story, and the person's not here, but I remember a person coming to area and said, you know something, we can change all of this like this. I know you charge all this stuff, but we can change all this just like that. And looked me dead in the face. So I think if there's a will, there's probably a way 100 years from now. We won't have Bob sitting on the trustee board. We won't be here necessarily talking about heritage or whatever. And the question I ask, will the people who come in, could be my great-grandchild, your great-grandchild, will they fight to keep Nineveh's name or Azurest's name? Will they fight to try to keep the essence of scale and character? And I surmise that, having been in business, the dollar is more important than any of that stuff. And so there is a risk.
Renee, I just want to let Bob add some clarity to this, ideally.
Ideally. Yes, I just want to say a couple things. Vicki, in particular, the elephant in the room here are the spec people versus homeowners, and spec people have a whole different outlook and spec building versus homeowner building, and that's really what's come into the picture. That's so true here in the village, in this part of the village, and they have a different outlook, they have a different motive, and it's not necessarily to preserve a neighborhood, it's to max out their profit. So
call them hedge funds.
okay. Well, so for instance, Vicki, the Peter Cook House, is an abomination. Now, as a politician, I'll say that was before my time, but they are also aimed or armed with attorneys, and they can be really expensive to fight and then you have to go to court, and a judge has to say that there was, even though it may be apparent to everyone in this room that this house is too big for this neighborhood, a judge in Riverhead might say, hey, it's just another house, what do you care? So there has not been a great track record of that. But I also say that these boards need volunteers. The ZBA, the ARB, anybody here who would like to put their name on the list and get to the point where you are the decision maker, that you're the one in the hearing talking about it, would be greatly appreciated, because that's where it happens. It doesn't happen at a board meeting. It happens at those meetings.
Let's go to this gentleman.
Thank you. My name is Will Sharp. I live in Nineveh. Unfortunately, we live in a culture where real estate speculation is a God-given right. 50 years ago, Harvey Milk tried to introduce the notion of a flip tax in San Francisco. And I don't think there are too many communities in the United States that has taken effect. Despite all of the efforts of the historical societies throughout America, there are many towns that have created ghost towns because the taxes of these properties become exorbitant. Nobody that's a legacy person or kind of a normal person can afford to live in these places. So what we're creating, look at our Main Street. If you go south of here, how many families live on Main Street that have their kids in public school? And I think it's pretty few. They're beautiful houses. They're historically righteous. They've been reconstructed. They're beautiful. They've followed most of the rules, et cetera. We need another vehicle to mitigate the flippers. And on Harding Terrace, we have, on the east side and the west side, we have two projects that were flip projects. The Peter Cook designed both of them. So they were all in scale and harmony, et cetera. I went to all of those boards and I argued all of the arguments. I actually convinced, I think, Bronster to divide the property on Lincoln into two projects rather than one, because the scale and harmony was ridiculous at one scale. Nevertheless, we need, as a community, to decide whether we want to allow flippers to exist, because you can have a righteous, historically correct house that you cannot afford to live in. And I would just give you an example of West Water Street, where the developers came in and they were originally going to do 16 units, correct me if I'm wrong, and they were required at that scale to put in a certain amount of money for low-income housing. The ultimate decision was for 3 or 4 units, and they were exempt from low-income housing. The ZBA, the powers that be, I don't know who they were. They failed in their mission to hold those people to their task. They got the park for free, et cetera. If we do not meet these people, as Bob talks about, at their level, they bring in very high-octane lawyers. We're doomed. We're doomed. And I ask you to walk down Main Street and see how many kids are coming out of those houses. Thank you very much for all of your efforts.
Thank you. Yeah, sure. Julian, go ahead.
I think, get my rare again. All excellent points. One thing I want to stress, the National Register being an honorific, it is up to the community to decide what kind of community they want to have. Any local designation is a local effort. Local voices, like you were saying, the people need to be at the table and voice what they want there, is a community effort and a community decision. And hopefully it brings the best out of us as a community and how we want our neighborhood, our downtown to move forward. Absolutely. I think speculative developers, speculative building has been a scourge across the United States. We see it upstate in our historic communities. We see it all over the place. So I think that's an excellent comment there. How do you deal with that? So multi-layered approach is needed. And most of it, and probably the greater bulk of it, is at the local level with your local municipality, local codes, and local issues. We're just providing an overlook on here's something significant. Maybe you should consider this as part of your community development. So that's where our role in the process is, to say, this is important here. How would you like to move forward with it? And the reality is, again, I'll stress it again, is that historic preservation is not about freezing time. It's not about stopping change, it's managing it. It's just a matter of what kind of community you want in the change that happens.
If I could also just respond, I had when you think about historic buildings, and I'd just like to say too also that Main Street is not the extent of the current historic district. It goes all the way over to Eastville, and there are people and students coming out of those houses going to school. I will also say too, if you have time to just Google 11 Eastville Avenue, which was in the historic district. Previously, the ARB code had a list of all of the members who should be on the ARB, which included a diversity of professions, like an architect, like an archaeologist. That has been removed from the code because it's one thing to volunteer to sit on a board, but if you're not coming from an informed opinion and attending training to understand what it really is, that's why we are in this situation. And that's how we lost 11 Eastville Avenue and many of the other houses that have come down in parts of the historic district. So I think that's really important to think about. I also am very grateful too to the legacy families that were here, that are still here. But at the same time, the process that we followed in the beginning was a collective, and we have some legacy families here. We have done oral histories. They have talked about it. So from the beginning of this process, when we spoke to people in the community one by one, then collectively, this is the outcome. Where we are today is of the will of the community. So we are now here in off-season when everybody's not here and everybody's not heard at this opinion of what we want it to be. And that's why moving forward, we will have to have 51%. We will have to have public hearings. We will continue to have education and be completely transparent, which is all we have been. So to think about a building that is preserved exactly the way it is. I talk to all of my museums and historical societies about this. Certain places you go to, and the place in Bethpage, it's wonderful. But you go there as a student, as a student. Now when you get older, you may not go back there ever again. Why? Because it's the same way it's always been. So preservation, and this happens with museums, preservation in museums, we are not saying that we are going to have this seat that you cannot sit on. If you do, it's a problem. The same thing with buildings. We have also preserved buildings that belong to municipalities, and I urge them, you have to do something with this building, because when we're gone 30 years from now, the same money that the community has raised or paid with community money is going to be needed again, because nobody can go there. You have no running water, you have no buildings, no usage. A prime example is Weeksville in Brooklyn. If you ever go to Weeksville, you'll see the houses that are preserved exactly the way they are, but if that was the only thing that was there, it would be a problem. So they have an ancillary building that they have built. So no one's saying that preservation is don't touch anything or do anything. You have to deal with it, as you said earlier, case by case. And to piggyback on what Sarah was saying, we are still in the process of moving forward, talking to the community. There is going to be a debate, and what Donnamarie has said, whatever it is, in the end, we will all have to agree. But I think we're putting the cart before the horse in many of these situations and comments that are happening.
We're going to go here, and then there.
Hi, Chris Tice. First of all, I want to thank everyone for being here. I've been here since the mid-'60s and have learned an enormous amount today, so thank you all. Two things. One, we heard what seems like really legitimate complaints about certain construction in the area, and at the same time heard from residents they don't want to be restricted or have additional restrictions on construction. And so I'm not advocating one or the other, but if there aren't changes to what you can do, you'll continue to have that problem of having structures go up that you don't want, because boards are volunteer and rotating, and there's so much subjective nature to what they do. No offense to any board members here. I'm a board member too. So I just want to point that out, that I don't think that the holy grail is we take each one individually, because how do you weigh, does that mean that you weigh differently for someone who hasn't been a resident for a long time, and the same structure would be decided differently for someone who's multi-generational? I don't know. But I'm just saying that without a change, I think you're going to continue to have the same thing. Secondly, I'm just curious from a process standpoint, because I tend to be very process-oriented, of where do you go from here? Is the next step to have the community members, and I think this would be what I would vote for, and I don't live in the community members to come together and to create a vision for what they want this to look like on an ongoing basis. How do they want this designation and the DNA of the community maintained in a way that it's realized long term, and have it defined in a tangent way so that there can then be processes, steps, guidelines that are filters to maintain it versus some esoteric idea that is hard to preserve because you don't have a roadmap. Does that make sense? So I'm not sure what the next steps are, but it would seem like that I would want the residents there to help create that roadmap.
So some communities with landmark ordinances, Roslyn is a good one. Roslyn has design guidelines for its historic district, and each different kind of building, there's some discussion of before a homeowner comes to the Preservation Commission, they can look at the guidelines and see, oh, that's not going to be good. I should do this. There's suggestions and guidance there. And it's not that you must do that. It's meant to, educate and share information. So you can get down the road a long way before you come to the board and you kind of, spend money on design, spend money on architects, spend money on consultants and your own time going before a board. So that's something Sag Harbor could do as a CLG. There's grant money available for making design guidelines. This, they could do right now for the existing district, for Eastville, for the other components of the district. Because like Georgette said, it's not just the old whaling houses right here. It's a lot of diversity of different kinds of buildings in different kinds of sizes. And that's another thing, someone was talking about value. A great way to make sure there's a diversity of value and a diversity of kinds of, residential uses is to make sure you're conserving existing buildings. Communities are naturally built in different phases. So there's different kinds of buildings for different kinds of uses, different kinds of families, different kinds of, if you're conserving a historic district, you're almost always embedding different size buildings, different size uses. So it helps you plan that diversity where there can be people who are new to the community who can come in at a lower real estate value. And then there's higher real estate value. And that's not so much a question of specific homeowners. So I agree with you. Different people are going to have different opinions. But from a perspective of planning, it's a different kind of question. And also, I wanted to say, I hear from folks from all around Long Island, and I have read so many local codes. It's like you don't want to know. Like if you need bedtime reading, pull up ecode.com and read a code, and you'll be asleep. But it's always shocking to me how different each code is. So East Hampton town has a totally different code, totally different zoning, totally different landmarking than the village of Sag Harbor. How many people have read the code? I'm not trying to be like a... So read the code. You'll be surprised because if you're going to put up a fence, every single person in the entire village, it doesn't matter if you're in the historic district or not, you must come before the ARB to get your fence approved. So the historic buildings get a little more scrutiny in terms of, different kinds of things that make them particularly special. But a lot of times folks will be shocked at what they have to go to apply for just basically with their own home. You're going to change your driveway. You're going to tear a tree down or something.
Thanks, Sarah.
You must go before the board.
Thank you. Bobby, wanted to add something, and we're going to go over to this young woman here.
Good. I just wanted to add that what you're saying is true in terms of code. Zoning boards are quasi-judicial boards. Zoning boards have 5 requirements that they are supposed to use to grant zoning. That's statewide, and they are benefit versus detriment to the neighborhood, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But there are 5, and those are universal to the state. So even though there are other, the ARB has different rules, but in terms of the ZBA, it is universal, and those are the standards that are supposed to be applied.
We're going to go with this gentleman. If you can just identify yourself.
Thank you, Renee Simons, Sag Harbor Hills. A couple of questions. One is, can historic and cultural designation coexist with rules? Okay? That's a big question. That's a thing that's in front of us all right here. And basically what I'm saying is, can they coexist? We've heard about the fear of loss of value, and we've heard about the fear of loss of history. Can those two things coexist? One of the things that's coming out of the discussion right now is that a lot of the questions have come up. Not because she is my wife, but the fact that this was started 4 years ago brings about questions that have not been addressed, from value, from heritage, from size, or anything else. So the point is, what's going to happen in the future? All right? The challenge goes to the boards. The challenge goes to Sarah and Julian. Are there examples of the coexistence of the rules and the boards and history? That's the solution we're looking for, okay? Now, the steps going forward is for that to happen, all right? So let's make that the next steps. Not worrying about fear, not worrying about loss of value, because you only lose value when you're about to sell, or gain value when you're about to sell. All the pieces, all the pieces. All the pieces. What I'm suggesting is all the comments here are right on target, okay? So the solution is going to become how we go and make it happen and who is responsible for it. I've heard about grant money. I've heard about resources. Those are the things that can come to play to come up with the right answer. But right now, we have not come up with the right answer. I had to make that comment. Thank you.
If I can just speak to that for a second.
Yes.
As I said earlier, this is not a new discussion. I don't know if you know the social satirist Fran Lebowitz. She was very active in the 80s. She said original thought is like original sin. Both happened a long time ago to people you could not have possibly known. So this is actually a very common discussion in communities such as Sag Harbor. You need to look to your local sources, your statewide sources, such as the Preservation League in New York State. You look at the Preservation Long Island. There are actually national resources for this kind of conversation. Way more expertise and way more down in the trenches than I have been. And that's what I'd encourage you to work through Preservation Long Island, to try to access those professionals. We bring certain tools to the fore, but when you get down to the local municipal level and these kind of discussions, these kind of questions, that's where you can pull on national expertise. Because this has happened in every community that has a preservation ordinance, and there are over 3,000 of the United States. There's over 250 in New York State. Almost 80 of those have a designation from us of being a certified local government, meaning you're doing a good job. Sag Harbor is one of those. Doing a good job means looking after your history, seeing what's out there that needs designation, and then again, managing that change, not freezing it, not stopping it. Again, historic preservation as a local municipal tool has proven not to depress property values. It stabilizes and improves because people can bank on what they can do in that neighborhood when they buy in or when they move in. Speculators don't want to hear that. But the people who want to live in that community, people who do live in that community, have that assurance that the community is not going to shift out from under them like a rug being pulled out from under them after 5 or 10 or 20 years. I have to share one story, and then I'm going to pass the baton on. When I've been coming to Sag Harbor for almost 35 years for work, and I've watched it start to do things like, frankly, in some parts become extremely gentrified. You know, you're losing your local stuff. You're looking at a hardware store, or dry cleaners, and that's what we said about Bethpage Village. You need a place you can live. You know, there's plenty of places out there to go and admire the architecture, but finding that balance where you can admire the history as embodied in the buildings and live is the balancing act that happens at the local municipal level. It really is. One of my favorite things that happened about 30 years ago, I was sitting at a board meeting in the hall, in the city hall, village hall, and a man came in and he said, "I just bought a house on so-and-so, and I want to rip the roof off." They said, "Why?" They said, "Well, he said, I'm 6'6", and the ceilings are 6'8", and upstairs." And I'm like, "Did you not do a walkthrough?" What happens here? You know, what happened? And he was assured by his realtor they could just rip it up and go another story. And the board said, "No, that's going to really be detrimental to the character of the neighborhood and the street." However, he could make modifications that worked for him, but not at the exterior roof line of the house. I think, you know, those balancing acts need to be found as you move forward here. If the community was, I'm going to use a really nasty word here, disfigured, okay? It could lose that designation because we look at what is there not only from the history, but also how the history is embodied in the built environment.
Thanks. We'll take one more question here.
Hi, Errol Taylor again. I think this discussion has been really, really helpful. And I'm happy that I was able to, travel out from the city and come here today. But I recognize that many of our neighbors have not been able to participate in this discussion. We're here in February, and by the nature of our communities, most of our residents are more here and more active in the summertime. And a bunch of the discussion has centered on, what kind of historic preservation we want going further. I think there's a threshold question as to whether the majority of the residents in the community want any village historic designation. Speaking personally, before we start talking about having quote-unquote outsiders, New York State preservation groups or consultants who have an interest in historic preservation, and that is their thing, tell us what we should be doing. I think the community should be engaged to, as a threshold level, make a decision as to how and whether we want to go forward. So it would be my desire that we, in my vernacular, pump the brakes a little bit, get our community involved, get the homeowners involved who this is going to impact most directly. And I'm not one of them. Get those involved, hear from them before we start talking about, consultants and New York State Historic Preservation and 7 to Save and all these other things in organizations who are great organizations, but their thing is preservation. Their thing is finding a way to restrict growth, restrict architecture, and maintain character of communities, which I'm all for. But I think my view is that we should engage our homeowners first. And we should do that in a way where we get the maximum opportunity to get them involved, sort of like we did when we were going through the national and state historic designation. So that's my final comment.
I totally hear what you're saying.
If I could ask the panel to respond to that's.
I totally hear what you're saying, and it's something, again, like Julian hears across the state, I hear across Long Island. I just want to say, Preservation Long Island is part of this community. We've owned and operated the Custom House on Main Street for since the 60s. So part of the reason why we really wanted to help Renee and Georgette, especially when she reached out, because Georgette is we work with local groups as a partner for the regional, kind of like Julian is the state, we're the regional. So we feel really committed to helping this community. And would we like to see more historic preservation? Of course, but we are also committed to the process being one that is transparent, that's being engaged with you folks. That's why I'm so excited that the Express has been doing these sessions. The one before that kind of addressed development and preservation. Wonderful conversations that other places across Long Island are not having. So this is fabulous, and I don't think Julian or I or any advocate would predetermine a decision. We want the process to be a good one, and so that's one reason why I was excited to do this. And I think Renee and Georgette have been really trying their best to make sure everybody has a voice heard, and the Express, it's going to be really, this is fabulous. I'm so excited because this is what we need. And then when the village might have some village-sponsored events, I don't know, then that can be a resource too. But there are resources available through the partners. So for one thing, we provide, my work with these folks has been part of our mission-based work. So they don't pay for me to help. This is our mission. We work with community members, and we've been around since 1948, and we've been stewards of the Custom House since the 60s. So we are really committed to Sag Harbor, and we've been part of the community for a while. So we are committed in a way as a stakeholder, and we want a good outcome for SANS and for the old district too. And also what I want to say before everybody leaves is, we are, so you were listed on the 7 to Save recently. The steering committee for the nomination and the survey work got a award from New York State Historic Preservation Office for excellence in that project. And yeah, it's fabulous. It's a statewide award. And we are going to be having a ceremony at the Custom House on May 23rd, which will be celebrating the work of the SANS survey and nomination. We're going to give them a Project Excellence Award for that project. And everyone is invited. Please join us at the Custom House.
If I could let Georgette get the last word here.
Okay. Well, I can talk really loud because I'm a cheerleader. I'll use this mic and I'll talk loud, so whoever wants to talk over me, they're welcome to do it. But what I would like to say is that a lot of the questions or statements that have come across today have been asked and answered repeatedly and overly. So I think at this point, we talked about the process. We've only followed the process, and we will continue to follow process. And I think the investment of this is, yes, we need the homeowners. We definitely need the legacy families, but the whole entire community, i.e. this side of the room that really didn't have much to say, also will come to, I'm poking fun at you. They will also come to the process. But we have been transparent. Us as community advocates, we only take down what you say and submit it. That's what's happened in the past. That's what's happened in that National Register form that went forward. That information did not come from us. That information came from the community, from your deeds, obituaries, or whatever we can find the information. So please do not think that this information has been led from us. We took down the information, oral histories, everything, and this went forward. We have followed step by step the process, and actually, we actually are working backwards because the first should have been the local. So we started with the top, with the state, and then they registered to the national. So the process, there is only going to be transparency, and we are going to be dependent on everyone to voice their opinion, and not a few, because this is not about a few. It is about the many. And I think, again, we cannot have displacement or disfigurement of the community and our stories and what you want to see happen. And we as advocates are only there to support right from wrong. And at this point, we have seen a lot of the wrong happening in the community, whether it's architectural, whether it's cultural, or whether it's environment. We know that we lost a beach over the winter. Had that been in another community, maybe that would not have happened. Okay, now what resources can we bring to this community to make sure that it is turned around? It was talking about buildings that are going up that we don't want to see. Well, like someone said earlier, you're actually in the lane of regulation. But because we do not have certain regulations and protections, that will continue to happen. Is it the answer? No, it is not. That's why I brought up 11 Eastville Avenue, because it was an historic district, and they actually obtained their certificate of appropriateness to demolish it. So when we think about what we are doing here, it's a discourse. It's a discourse that hopefully we are not just using our heads, because sometimes something that's in there may not be 100% correct. So as we move forward, this morning I saw on the show, on news, and I don't normally watch this channel, it's about heart to heart, breast to breast. The song she was saying, reach out and touch someone's hand, make this world a better place. Give me your hand. Do your neighbor. Reach out and touch someone and make this a better place. That's what we're trying to do. We're not trying to diminish anyone's value. We're not trying to push anyone around. We are only trying to do what should have been done a long time ago that was neglected.
Thank you. Thanks, Georgette. Thank you all. We've got to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to give you back to Gavin.
All right, thank you all. We're going to have full coverage next week. If you didn't get a chance to say something, letters@sagharborexpress.com. Write a letter to the editor next week, and we can continue the conversation. Thank you.